Dr. Khoza, your birthday is on the 31st of December.
Yes.
Um,
in the afternoon.
In the afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
And the next day is New Year's. Who remembers somebody's birthday on the 31st of December when it's all about New Year?
Just about nobody. My late father remembered to a degree, my mother to an even less degree, because they expected me to actually be the one who forks out what needs to make them happy. My family lately couldn't be bothered. They do give me some little symbolic stuff, but they are more concerned about New Year's Day or New Year's Eve. That's the preoccupation.
So is that one of the reasons why you many a times are walking on your own in terms of the battles that you fight or the issues that you raise in the public domain to be remembered?
I guess occasionally principled people will stand for principle that is not apparent to many. Perhaps that explains it a little bit more. But more often than not, I actually work in teams. My understanding stems from my belief in the African expression, more prominent in the Sotho group that goes ditau tsa go tlhoka sevoka di sitwa ke nare e tlotsa. In other words, a pride of lions that fails to cooperate will fail to bring down even a limping buffalo. So I know that being a lone ranger doesn't take you very, very far. There is also yet another expression that's very, very common amongst black South Africans, that if you want to go far, go with others. And if you want to go fast, try it alone. But chances are you'll stumble a number of times unduly.
There's also an African proverb that goes like this: if you walk in a crowd, the crocodile will not eat you up.
So true, because the crocodile has difficulty as to who to choose in the crowd. But if you're on your own, you're dead meat, to use an expression.
So why is that critical for you?
To be part of a team, I believe therein lies a great deal of strength. But in much the same way as some of our political leaders, in particular the likes of Mandela, worked inside a group, but occasionally stepped ahead of the group and beckoned for the group to follow. I believe anyone who is lucky to be in a leadership position understands that leadership is leadership from within more often than it is from the front. But every now and then, because a vision is more often than not articulated by an individual who reads the dynamics of the group, understands their aspirations, understands their contemporary needs, even understands where they are in the historical conjuncture, such a leader will occasionally step ahead in the full confidence that the group will follow, because it does that, or she does that, from a base of understanding.
Your business reputation in financing, you started building since 1981. It was at the height of oppression.
Correct.
And brutality of the apartheid state. How did a black man of African descent being able to do that, given that the apartheid state was geared towards destroying the morality and the dignity of black people?
Yeah, that observation is very, very apt, but there is a sense in which if you mean to provide some bit of leadership, you get to understand that you have a date with destiny. And from that date, and as understood by you, that date with destiny, you derive your destination, which others call a vision. And if that is powerful enough, it keeps beckoning, regardless of what happens around you, in this particular instance, the apartheid oppressive and detrimental circumstances notwithstanding.
So in 2012, you came out against the leadership of President Zuma. Why did you think at that moment that you needed to speak out? Was it part of that loneliness of 31st of December? Nobody remembers?
There's a very real sense in which I didn't come against the leadership or government of President Zuma per se. If you go back to my chairman's statement, you will actually have serious difficulty finding anybody's name or any institution's name. I made an observation about the prevailing conditions, and the guilty somehow stepped into the trap. I did not mention anybody by name. I was worried about what I saw as an emerging leadership that was devoid of a moral base, whose moral quotient, as I put it, was degenerating. And if President Zuma, or even the ANC, or even certain business leaders stepped into that, they stepped into that essentially out of their sense of guilt. I didn't mention anybody's name.
So what's with the historic record? How would you correct a historic record that's in the public domain, which is essentially a misinterpretation of what you're saying?
That's not a misinterpretation. It's an interpretation. If you make a principled statement, people will elaborate on that, and they'll find culprits. They'll even find heroes and villains. And I believe South Africa Incorporated, or if you like, our political economy, actually identify the villains. But if you mean to make a definitive statement that is not incriminating, for which you cannot in fact go to jail, but you make it sufficiently powerfully, there are a number of forces that will come to the fore and identify the villains and the heroes, and actually ascribe the guilt to those that happen to be guilty. It so happens that, in fact, the media, both social and the public media that we are historically familiar with, in the majority of cases, came to my support. There are a few people that actually said, apologize so that the ANC, amongst others, doesn't blast you. And I said, apologize for what? I wasn't guilty of anything. I took a stance and said to all and sundry, this is the stance I take, shoot me or support me. It so happens that there was a preponderance of support. There are press cuttings and other forms of support, electronic, that are in superabundance in terms of supporting the particular stance. And if you look at the situation several years later, there is a sense in which I believe I am being vindicated.
When you say that there's a moral degeneration in leadership, surely you should have had a standard of measure.
Yeah.
What was your standard of measure to be able to articulate that position that you took?
Moral issues don't have quantitative measures like you would measure mathematically, or even in terms of accountancy if you're an accountant. But those measures that claim precision are not necessarily superior measures. There are other measures. And as I said earlier on, the preponderance of support for me is a more significant measure than anybody giving me that statistically this is significant. On issues of morality, issues of ethics, your sense of right and wrong is what matters, not whether or not the wrongness can be quantified and attach a number, like it's 65% right and 35% wrong.
So what were the ethical dilemmas at the time then?
Oh, quite a number. I was observing first the emergence of leadership, leaders that emerge in whatever institution, I believe should not be cast ashore by a wave of populism. I don't mind popularity. You and I would actually be quite happy with a leader who is popularly acclaimed to be a leader. But populism, like so many other isms, is not anything that any leader of substance, particularly at the national level, should rely on to come to the fore. That was the one observation. The second observation was what I perceived to have been the leadership emerging that way, using a fairly popular leader as a Trojan horse. Some might say a useful person or personality, and those that may be somewhat uncomplimentary could actually even, describe it a little more painfully. So that in itself, in my study of leadership, said questionable. And secondly, the amount of looting, some of which was done subtly, the other of which was actually pretty naked in provinces and in municipalities, as well as at the national level, for anybody who cared to observe, was beginning to be a serious worry. There was institutional thieving, institutional stealing, which some social scientists would characterize as kleptocracy, where government would exercise, if you like, nepotism and get away with it. If I'm a Khoza, somehow a host of Khozas, because there are so many, will find their way to get their snouts into the trough. And they don't qualify on merit. They qualify purely because they're close to me by blood, or they're close to me in terms of how useful I believe they will be in unfairly feathering my nest. And that was just about all over for anybody to observe. And I had to articulate this as a bit of a warning at the time, because it was budding, it was emerging.
To the ordinary citizens and the youth, when you say there were lots of looting, there was lots of looting taking place, what are you actually referring to?
So some of it pretty naked, where if you go to a province, and some of the provinces one can actually even mention by name, but there's no need to do that because it's rampant. It was almost like South Africa replete with that. You knew that in order for you even to get permission to do business, you had to grease somebody's palm. That's rampant even to this day. And a good number of the premiers that we have in this country, some still in place, others fallen from grace. It's known that they had money that was ill-begotten, that the money is actually not even put in banks, because if put it in banks, SARS will ask a number of questions as to what is the source of the revenue. And as I say, you don't actually even have to isolate any of the provinces. Some of the provinces are my home provinces, so I maintain ties with that, and I tried to actually, even to build a school, you need to grease somebody's palm. To build one school, which is one of sort of the showpieces in the Mpumalanga area, it actually took me 7 years just to get the green light. I'm not benefiting R1. I just wanted to benefit the community that gave birth to me. But in order for me to do that, I had to grease somebody else's palm. I refused consistently hence the red tape and the delay. And when it ultimately happened, because I wanted to have it as a PPP school where I'll partner with the province, there was an insistence that there should be a supervisory body between our identification and selection of the contractor and the actual delivery. And I said, but what is the need of this thing? And nobody could really explain, but already we had actually gotten started. I had raised about 25 million and asked government to match me rand for rand. So that was in place, but they imposed a structure that was putatively or ostensibly supervisory. But it is evident to anybody who has eyes to see that that was in fact squatting as a parasite on the system.
Before I move away from the statement that you made as the chairperson of Nedbank at the time, some would say that it was rather a reach for you to use the platform of Nedbank, who's got international interests, both outside and inside South Africa, to use that platform to make a statement. Almost similar to a politician using certain platforms where he or she knows they can use that as a shield.
Yeah.
What's your response to that?
About describe it as a gross misreading. If somebody wants to describe it as rich, that's fine. I don't think it was rich at all. If you are a chairman of a significant institution, you articulate your observation, you warn your shareholders about what it is you believe they need to know to make informed decisions. And that's exactly what I was doing. Anybody who describes that as rich, there is a sense in which I believe their understanding of corporate governance, which is leadership in practice, is scanty. And I accept that they can use those kinds of expletives, descriptives, but I don't believe there was anything rich there. There is a sense in which if you make a statement like that and is seen as very irresponsible, your shareholders would actually punish you. But the AGM that followed, I was returned to my chairmanship by no less than 98.57%. In the previous year, it was 99 comma something. So perhaps a fraction disapproved. But I want to believe that 98 plus is overwhelming support of the stance that I had taken. In fact, the day following the over-publicity of the stance by a business paper, I was on my way to the mother body, to Nedbank in the UK, Old Mutual PLC. And upon arrival, the chairman wanted to chat to me and said, "Have you seen this?" And I said, "No, I have not actually seen it, but a colleague of mine has called me." And he said, "What do you think about it?" I said, "Exactly what is stated there." And he smiled and he said, "Well, in fact, I believe what South Africa needs is bold leadership. So where we are concerned, you got our support."
So the international newspapers also carried your chairperson's exposition about the nature and extent of leadership at the time in South Africa?
Oh, certainly. Financial Times, I think there's a journalist in Financial Times, I forget the name, described that statement as perhaps a milder version of statements I had made before. I had opened a session of the Institute of Directors, of which I'm president, whose theme was courageous conversations. And the language there was slightly stronger than what was contained, because I mean that was me just speaking, as opposed to in a chairman capacity. This guy described the kind of language I used as effective in the sense that it was actually barbed, like in barbed wire, or acerbic, like in bitter as gall. but stating the facts. And it was very complimentary. And that was not just, that was not one of the statements, it was one of several statements by even in the international media.
How did you manage to get more than 98% of support on both terms amongst the shareholders, the people that were at the AGM of Nedbank?
I think essentially,
what made them believe in you?
Essentially because I probably articulated what they themselves would have loved to have articulated. Some would have been milder than I have been, others perhaps would have been even more strident. So it struck a responsive chord, essentially, because I think it was representative of what a good number of people felt.
You spoke earlier about the importance of the team, and you, the leader. As the chairperson, surely you were sitting with different people from different diverse backgrounds.
Correct.
Cultures, language, race and gender, if you like. How did you go about managing the board with all these different people around the table, different interests?
I think just like some of our other leaders did, you try to understand the dynamics, you try to cultivate what support you may, you try to consult, you try to be inclusive. So much so that, you know, by the time you articulate that which you articulate, people are already aligned in your support. And that is my leadership style. I would not stridently step ahead without fully understanding the dynamics. Whether that is in my leadership of as president of the Institute of Directors, or as chairman of a variety of companies, as chairman of a variety of NGOs, or even as a visiting professor. I don't get into the class and say, well, the world is structured this way. I step into the classroom and say, well, there are the following factors as I see them. What are some of the factors that you see? What might we actually decipher from the situation? What instructive lessons are there? And more often than not, even as a visiting professor who's supposed to be teaching for an hour and a half, more often than not, when I go to places like Rhodes, when I go to places like USB of Stellenbosch University, or offices, as in the Free State, which universities I taught at as a visiting professor quite often. That approach generates so much participation that 1.5 hour long lecture winds up being 4.5 hours.
Part of your responsibilities is to service a public intellectual, but you're also involved in a number of organizations, institutions, and companies. Mm-hmm. How do you navigate the competing interests?
I guess one of your best bets is to use as your anchor, principle-centered leadership or management. That is crucial. But also, in addition to that, to have a compass. And for me, that compass, which actually serves as, if you like, the pricking of conscience, the compunction, is African humanism, or Ubuntu, as I understand it. And with that compass, I think you actually will navigate relatively successfully. I don't believe I've been singularly successful. Occasionally you get bashed, occasionally you get bruised. And more often than not, if you have a sound compass and you also have a sound point of departure in being a principle-centered leader, more often than not, you are successful.
What is a principle-centered leader?
But what do you believe in? What is your set of values? And for me, there are a number of values that constitute the value system that actually says this is the base on which I am predicated. And those would include what some have called integrity, stroke, honesty. It would include what I consider to be the necessity to coexist or cohabit the world with other people. In other words, create space for others to express themselves in as much as you claim space for expression. One that I've been criticized for more often than not is one called probity, which essentially relates to striving to behave in a manner that is beyond reproach. Because they say, well, I mean, who is actually behaving in a manner that is beyond reproach? I said, perhaps close to nobody. But that does not detract from its importance as a beckoning principle. And so one can go on. I mean, caring, a propensity to share, and all of those as a cluster of values constitute what I would describe as the base on which I strive to base my principle-centered leadership, my principle-centered behavior. And I've gone also on record on saying that if for any reason there was a kingdom called the kingdom of leadership, I want to believe that standing at the gate or at the entrance to that kingdom would not be the angel Gabriel, but it would be the angel humility. So humility is one of my values, and that I derive from dealing with all manner of people, but the one person who has had an overwhelming impact where humility is concerned, an overwhelming impact on me, was Walter Sisulu. Upon release from the island, I met with him, greeted him. I tried to introduce myself. He said, "Stop it." I said, "But how? But why?" He said, "But I know you. While still in jail, I read no less than 3 articles that you have written, and I agree with you 100%. And I know what it is you did also to facilitate our getting offices as the ANC in the center of town." And I was humbled. 9 months later, we meet again because he's an elder. You know, he was in the age bracket of my father. I greet him and have to introduce myself because he meets so many people. And he says, "But I told you not to." For me, that's the kind of leader I'll follow any day. So the angel Gabriel replaced by the angel humility. And if you go into any situation, particularly a leadership situation, and you are haughty and arrogant, you invite people to pull you down. But if you get in there with what my father somewhat unkindly referred to as intelligent ignorance, you go into the situation in learning mode, everybody will come in there to educate you. And as they educate you, whatever blind spots you may have had reduce. Or so argued my late preacher father.
What would be your response if somebody says to you, "That's good and well. And those sounds like rhapsodies of good human behavior, expected good human behavior, and good relations that people ought to have. But we live in a world of rugged materialism and individualism, where it's about accumulation of wealth, of resources. That's what the capitalist system wants us to be."
Correct.
What would your response be to that?
I would say that rhapsodies are not necessarily ill-advised. Rhapsodies are beacons that actually remind you about, if you like, what Aristotle called the good life. Not the good life in material sense, but the good life in being good to yourself and good to fellow beings. Materialism is rampant. particularly in those for those in leadership positions. So I've been castigated for being given very good leadership positions and remaining essentially poor. And my argument was that I don't believe in my leadership position the thrust should be self-aggrandizement. The thrust should, in fact, to provide leadership. Material things, if I want to amass material things, I will actually go work elsewhere. Where national duty calls, I'll deliver on what national duty demands. Where material things are concerned, I will actually be an entrepreneur that strives to behave in a manner that is above board. If my accumulation is less than that of others who actually got to be as rich as they are by accessing political largesse and other allied things to that questionable approach to amassing wealth, good luck to them. There's a sense in which I believe you can only eat so much, you can only sleep in so many houses, you can only drive so many cars. Beyond that, it becomes so bizarre. It actually, it's inimical even to your spirit.
Given what you just said, a key question that comes up is that 1990 to the end of Nelson Mandela's era was a period of transition. Mm-hmm. Then Thabo Mbeki, until the end of Thabo Mbeki's era was also, President Thabo Mbeki's era was also an era of transition.
Yeah.
What is different now that wasn't there in the 90s to the end of President Thabo Mbeki's era as the president of the country?
I believe there could be numerous interpretations. I'm on record as having stated that in order for anybody to lead in the 21st century, there are a number of criteria they need to satisfy. And amongst those, I have mentioned an ethical base or moral suasion as opposed to coercion in providing leadership. I've mentioned amongst those the ability to deal with complexity because you're operating in a world that is increasingly getting more and more complex. And thirdly, I felt whoever wants to lead in the 21st century, if it's in the area of politics, must understand that politics is not unfolding in vacuum. It does have a twin sister or twin brother called economics. So they must understand that they are actually operating in a political economy. They must understand economics and politics in depth. I have also stated that amongst other criteria, we live in an environment that is globalizing at a very fast rate. So whoever wants to lead, particularly lead a country in the 21st century, must understand the phenomenon of globality and the process of globalization and how to access whatever it delivers in a manner that is at the very minimum equi-beneficial to their country and at optimum more beneficial to their country. And then the whole issue of morality, which I think I have referred to a little earlier. Those in combination, for me, describe the leader of the 21st century. And if I look around today, my assessment, it's just a subjective assessment, says current leadership doesn't quite stack up when put in juxtaposition to those requirements of the 21st century.
The present, aren't we paying the price for not having a discussion on the economy when there was a time of negotiations for South Africa's constitutional state? Mm. And you correctly so indicating there's business and politics are interwoven. So aren't we experiencing a situation now that because we didn't discuss the economy of the country at the time and negotiate around ownership of the economy.
Yeah.
That we're paying the price now.
Yeah. Good observation. I think we are. But that should not actually absolve us from doing something about the situation, from doing something now. There is a sense in which a Mandela, you referred to as having presided over transformation, would deliver, and could perhaps deliver 60%, 70%, even 90%. But the 10% that might actually be pivotal in rendering real economic equity, he may have fallen short. But you and I are alive right now, and we have done an analysis. It behoves us to actually render common that analysis and use it as a force for correcting the wrongs or for topping up on the inadequacies of what was negotiated at the time of negotiation.
If you were part of the negotiations at the time and had the opportunity to engage on these matters, what would your advice be, given that hindsight is a good science?
It's a perfect science, yeah. I believe a number of things. And there's quite a bit that you can do by way of transforming an organization and transforming organizations and institutions. One would actually have, right at the beginning, have made it very, very clear to the people at the negotiation table. But you know, one of the flaws, even about the people who were there at the negotiation table, is that the majority of them were politicians and not not economists. So the emphasis clearly had to be skewed in favor of, we're going to vote. So we fought for your vote, and you use your vote to transform, which is not a faulty approach, by the way, because you know, once you are in political power, you can actually legislate for corrective action. So had one been there, first the analysis would probably have been slightly more thorough and less skewed. One would have argued that the monster that is apartheid was actually politics of oppression, politics of suppression in very significant measure, but in much more significant measure, it was economics of exploitation. So in addressing the liberation struggle as something that should give people a vote, hid the fact that apartheid was economics of exclusion, economics of exploitation, economics of domination. So there is a sense in which I believe the analysis, even at the time, tended to overemphasize the political side, when in fact you are dealing with a political economy whose economic imperatives in certain respects should have loomed a little larger. So if the analysis actually came up with that understanding, that apartheid more significantly was economics of oppressing others, economics of exploiting them in the wake of that oppression, of economics of dominating them in the wake of all of that, I believe the deliberations would actually have yielded something perhaps more compelling, more acceptable than perhaps we see in hindsight.
Are you okay? Yes, good. How would you characterize the leadership transition that has happened in South Africa from the time of President Nelson Mandela negotiating, the leader of negotiations with other parties, into government, and the period of the 20 years? What are the golden issues, the golden nuggets of the leadership as opposed to the leader that has happened over this period? Are there any lessons for kids
of
the next generation, given the current generation blaming the future, the present, previous generations. You know?
I think there are lots of lessons that one could extract from the 2 decades of our period as a democracy. Some of the things that I try to communicate across and use as a basis for conversation is that perhaps at this juncture, we as a nation, when it comes to electing our leaders, putting them in leadership positions, we must prescribe. In other words, some of the criteria that I said earlier on, but at the same time, we must proscribe. In other words, I must be able to say, unless Daniel meets the following criteria, he should not even have pretenses to leading me as a youth. He should not have any pretenses to leading me as a member of the intelligentsia. He should have no pretenses to leading me as a member of the Acornhoek or Nelspruit community. Proscriptions and prescriptions. So in other words, somebody who, for whatever reason, is morally degenerate, the proscription should be because he doesn't meet the moral muster or satisfy the moral muster. He should not even try to pretend he can lead me, because I consider that a very important thing. The master of knowledgeability. I believe, Mandela was very knowledgeable. The history of the ANC is replete with it being led by members of the intelligentsia, lawyers, teachers, doctors, from 1912 onwards. And I see no reason why there should be no insistence, particularly in a world that is even more complex. There should be no insistence on knowledgeability as a criterion for anybody stepping into a leadership position. And I believe that's one of the areas in which we have fallen a bit flat. I'm not saying that all of the people in leadership now are not knowledgeable, but I'm saying a good number, evident from their behavior, whether they're heading up our communications ministry, and a number of ministries, including energy or whatever, a good number, in fact, don't quite stack up on the criterion of knowledgeability. In the 21st century, you cannot ride on the wave of just populism. You should actually drill a little deeper.
Somebody will say to you that is good and well. There's lots of fraud and corruption happening, the rampant nature of the looting. There's a corruptee and a corrupter. And in most instances, business people are at the forefront. What is the moral? Isn't there also moral degeneration that's happening in a powerful business sector which captures and corrupts the state who's supposed to look after its citizens?
Yeah.
What would you say needs to happen in that instance?
I guess the same statement that I made in 2012, as you correctly pointed out, did not mention anybody's names, essentially because of the argument that you're putting forward, that for a corruptee to thrive, there's got to be a corruptor. Corruptee and corruptee are in perfect tango. There is a sense in which, in terms of the corporate governance, that the King Code, of which I'm an integral part, actually argues against that. The first chapter in King 3 deals with the issue of morality. I argue, or we argue in there, that leadership that is not ethically based is in fact not leadership, but misleadership. Because misleadership is a form of leadership. It can be very effective, but is it good? Is it not inimical to the welfare of the majority. And if it is misleadership and should actually be frowned upon. And I believe the followership should proceed to stop it dead on its tracks.
You were saying in one report, and I quote, the country needs a kind of entrepreneur with a combination of expert knowledge, skills and understanding of how best to deploy capital.
Yes.
Explain that.
I think it's so important. The skills, the expertise to utilize what capital we have, not to misuse it, not to abuse it, not to ill-distribute it. It's so crucial for the success of any economy, and most of all, our economy as an emergent economy, an economy that at the outset actually looked like, a political economy that at the outset looked like it was going to be exemplary. So the need for that kind of expertise, that kind of skill, that kind of knowledge base is crucial. But that also has to be informed by a moral base or an ethical compass.
So the entrepreneur has got knowledge and skills and understanding.
Yes,
so
but lacks
what is
that.
wrong with
It lacks the latter. What I said, underscoring that, a moral base and an ethical compass. Entrepreneurs are, in my book, are almost totally heartless. They are without conscience. Not conscience in sort of biblical sense, but conscience in the sense of compunction, the conscience that actually says this should not be the done thing because it is inimical to the rest of humanity. It might actually benefit me materially, but it's inimical to those that I purport to lead, those that I purport to be living with in a spirit of mutuality.
Are you the devil in the flesh of a number of leaders within the country across the spectrum? And if so, why do you think people consider you as?
I don't know. I don't know if anybody considers me a devil. There may be those that are at variance with what I try to stand for. But evil, I haven't come across anybody describing me as evil or devilish. I think that will go into extremes. As innocuous as creatures come, as harmless as creatures come. But I do stand for something. I'm nowhere near perfect. There's no such thing as being close to perfect. I got my fair share of human frailty, but that should not actually stop me from trying to do that which I believe would be good in the national interest.
Explain the national interest.
The national interest is that which actually benefits the nation and does not pull the nation down. And you can actually break that apart and into its constituent elements. And that would, amongst others, lead to us talking about what I said earlier on. The national interest will include a national vision. And I believe we do have it to a degree in the National Development Plan. But the National Development Plan, I think it's a little excessive on verbiage. I try to remember the content, and I battle. If you read its vision, it's fantastic poetry. It's about 4 pages. My understanding of a vision as a person who deals with strategy and teaches strategy is that a vision statement should actually be as short as can be. 2-3 sentences should actually state it, and then followed perhaps by your purpose or sense of purpose, which is the mission statement. That should be just as short. You begin to be elaborative when you talk strategy. And some of the things that I believe that national vision lacks is timelines, time frames, and deadlines. And there's got to be gradations of those deadlines. So there is a sense in which I believe the national interest should be defined in there, and then you flesh that out. You come with the constituent elements that says this should be done in the national interest, and the national interest is.
Well, my last three questions is that in the public discourse of how to bring about growth and development, economic growth and development in the country, you raise a tension between building industrialists and black pedigree. What are you trying to say to us as a nation?
That first there should be a culture of industry. In other words, we should be industrious as a nation. Here we're beaten even by our neighbors from Zimbabwe. You know, if the Zimbabweans come here, their degree of diligence, their degree of dedication, it's a marvel to behold, where a good number of South Africans just float as opposed to doing something definitive. So industrialization with the requisite diligence and the requisite dedication is crucial. A nation that does not manufacture but relies on other people manufacturing for it, a nation that has massive raw materials but does not beneficiate, is a nation heading in a disastrous Western direction. There have been talks about, you know, why don't we work hard at developing 100 industrialists? I think that's myopic. I would like to see South Africa replete with industrialists. And that does not just happen incidentally. It has to be made to happen intentionally. In other words, in planning for the nation, you should actually dedicate a fair attention to cultivating and nourishing industrialists and entrepreneurs. Small businesses that should be nourished to big businesses, medium-sized businesses, in all industries, including the so-called post-industrial era, you know, with ICT at the center of it. You've got to cultivate and nourish all of those kinds of industrialists.
So what does that got to do with developing a black pedigree?
Yeah, the problem is that, in fact, if you look at South Africa, for instance, whether you're looking at the highly knowledgeable people in law who even write our tax laws and all of those, they tend to come from people other than black, in spite of the fact that we are in excess of 80% of the population. The majority of specialist surgeons, specialist tax experts, specialist accountants, and so on and so forth, is still drawn from 7 to 10% of the population. And black people clamor to be empowered, and all that they bring to the table in the majority of instances, it's so-called connections. It's so-called blackness, you know, help me, I mean, enable me or empower me purely and simply because I am black. And I bring nothing by way of intellectual capital. So what I'm arguing for is that the black people must learn to bring something to the table. And the best of capital for any development is, in fact, intellectual capital. If you look at those that have revolutionized the world, your Bill Gates of this world, their real capital is intellectual. I do agree with my countrymen that, you know, return the land to us. That's fine. But if you ask Bill Gates how much land he has, chances are I'll tell you very, very little. And what land I have, I rent. But intellectual capital galore, and I've conquered the world. I'm using me as one example. There are numerous. The richest of the people who actually lead the world very, very little land. I'm not saying that land is not important. I would actually be betraying even myself because I am a farmer. And I grow food even for export. The avocados that I grow, I export upward of 85% of to Europe. 2 years back, my farming activities, including the packing and export, was rated the second largest exporter to Europe. But most people just see Khoza as this guy who pontificates.
Since 1981, you've been involved in business to date. What stands out as one of your key contributions in terms of economic governance, economic democracy within business, especially in the boardroom? What would you say is Dr. Reuel Khoza legacy? You must have thought about this.
I believe people do imagine all manner of things that should be written on their tombstones as epitaphs and stuff like that. But I believe a legacy is not something that you can prescribe as the individual player. It is those around you who might treasure or value what it is you do who will actually describe your legacy. Not even your family, because your family will be subjective. It is the people that in one form or another you may have touched in doing that which you believe you do for the greater good. So I don't even try to crystallize what I fancy should be my legacy. That's the duty of people who I've had the fortune of living with, who might value or not even value what it is I might have fancied is my contribution. I leave it to them and to posterity.
What would your advice be for the next generation of leadership, politically speaking, in business, in social movements, in South Africa and on a continent?
I would suggest, but I mean there are many observations that I've made. I don't believe time permits, but I would suggest that the youth of today must think beyond tomorrow. They must crystallize for themselves a sense of destiny, which will help them define their personal vision. And it is from that personal vision that they can actually work backwards to what you might call your strategy to realize that personal vision. And in the wake of that, be a net contributor to those around you, to your family, your village, your city, your nation, very, very importantly, and stretch yourself to be a net contributor to your continent. Know your continent, Africa, make a difference at that sort of level, stretch yourself to be a net contributor there, make a difference, and in the wake of that, also help Africa to be welcomed in the world of nations, in the world of other continents, in a manner that is unconditional, in a manner that is not derisive, in a manner that is not condescending. And I would suggest the youth of today should strive to deliver on that score.
Dr. Khoza, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Much appreciated.